Okay, this is a video about chapter 0.1 by Garnet Hertz on my new book, Art and DIY Electronics, that just came today. I'm sitting out here where I was waiting for the delivery guy, and I'm making videos. Just quick overviews. So, this is chapter 0.1, A History of Electronic Art in the 20th Century. What I try to do is try to explain the idea of making as a century old term or a century old concept. Electronics and art have been, and creative electronics have been, at least in the contemporary art scene, a thing for at least 100 years. And I try to do that, kind of paint a picture of that history. In general, I think the history of media art, art and technology, or even things like critical design really need history around them. I see a big lack of historical research around technology and art, or artists that use technology. So I start out this chapter by talking about the idea of electronic art. I intentionally kind of don't use words like new media art or digital art to talk about this. I use this older term of electronic art to try to encompass a whole bunch of different stuff. So I start out by talking about how Picasso, Duchamp, and other people that were working in the 1910s, Cara, Picasso, and this idea of the found object, how kind of everyday stuff was starting to be glued onto canvases, and this really evolved into using pre-made everyday technological artifacts as well, clocks, radios, and this kind of thing. My argument is that this is really the avenue that technology in the contemporary era entered into art, is really through the ready-made. And and it owes quite a bit of history and inspiration from the idea of Dada, and kind of shocking shocking the art world by adding unusual components to it and going beyond the canvas. And what the the next kind of movement that happens here after the idea of the ready-made and the kind of using everyday objects to shock art communities and the establishment, um, I, I then talk about how this kind of electric, on and off electric simple circuits led into this idea of the electronic. I make a distinction between the electric and the electronic. The electric is essentially non informational, it's sort of like a light switch. Electronic is more like a radio, information processing, uh, or a cassette player, or a system that can store and manipulate information. And this was, you know, because artists had been working with and exploring kinetics or movement and in machines and light and this kind of stuff. But the idea of interaction didn't really come into its heyday until the idea of cybernetics came along. Now, I describe cybernetics, which is a interdisciplinary movement in the sciences that really led to the birth of the information age and the computing age. I provide an overview of that, and I talk about how in a lot of ways the work that artists did throughout the 20th century, a lot of it has been sort of ready-made or prefab. Um, there has been a component of artists that do incorporate electronics, but they do it where they're not really exploring the technology, but they're using it almost as a ready-made kind of object. So then I move into experiments in art and technology with Billy Kluver, Robert Rauschenberg, Jasper Johns, Warhol, John Cage, and a whole bunch of different folks. How this organization came to be, and then into this idea of artists as socio-technical researchers. And I do borrow from McLuhan's metaphor for artists as antenna in the 1960s, and how artists really explored the future through technology and creative electronics. Then in the 80s, we have this, following in the spirit of EAT, you saw other organizations form. And in the 80s, they started to get more real estate and kept kind of forming symposia and this kind of stuff. ICEA, Interaccess in Toronto, V2. These are pictures from V2 in the Netherlands, some of their first projects. Everything from Brian Eno to Ars Electronica, and seeing how these kind of like underground institutions formed. And throughout the book, I actually use Raphael Lozano Hammer's idea of the effect. This is an idea that when a new technology comes out, that folks are typically fascinated by the potentials of the new technology. Lozano Hammer refers to this as the effect, where the special effect of the new tech kind of overshadows everything. I refer to this repeatedly in terms of technology and culture and art as a theme. Then the next kind of pivot I see, or main kind of thing that took place over the past 100 years, is Web 2.0. In many ways, or I put forward the argument that the Web 2.0, which I saw transitioning around, 2005, that's really when new media and the potentials of technology started to shift quite a bit, where you stopped having folks doing new media work that was explaining and exploring the effect, and instead where it started to be a business and not so much new anymore. MySpace was in 2003, Vimeo and Facebook in 2004, YouTube in 2005. Those things really shifted, I would say, away from new media and into more contemporary times. I also do talk about critical design. Through the book, I do blur the boundary between art and design, and I do talk about Dunn and Raby and other folks, Julian Bleecker, for example, Bruce Sterling, about how critical design relates to exploratory work in the arts. And then I conclude by saying that electronic art and a lot of work with technology is basically best understood as artists exploring technology as a DIY practice. And that's okay, and that's good. And I spend the rest of the book explaining why it's good. All right, so the next video I'll talk about defining DIY, and that is chapter 0.1 in Art and DIY Electronics.